Welcome to today's Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today we're joined by Christian Post reporter Michael Gryboski to talk all about the United Methodist Church's General Conference. Lots of big developments there today that we will be covering here on the show. With no further ado, here is Michael Gryboski. So we're tackling an important topic, the United Methodist Church General Conference. And for a lot of people who are non-denominational Christians like me, they may not be as familiar with these general conferences that some of the denominations have. But can you break down for us, what is the General Conference for those who don't know?
All right. Well, the General Conference is a denomination-wide legislative gathering that takes place every 4 years. The United Methodist Church brings together its delegates and other church officials from all over the world, because it is a global denomination, and they come together to propose the policies, vote on policies, hear reports, these types of things.
Very good. So, as we're looking at this issue, the United Methodist Church has, for a very long time, been grappling with different issues within the denomination. There's been splintering. We've seen in recent years a lot of churches walking away from the denomination. What are some of the big issues that have been plaguing the United Methodist Church for some time now?
The big issues have been centered on its Book of Discipline, which is its central rule book, which for decades held to the position that homosexuality was, and I quote, incompatible with Christian teaching, end quote. And along those lines, it prohibited the ordination of individuals who were in same sex relationships. It prohibited clergy from officiating same sex weddings. And it prohibited the denomination from contributing funding and money to LGBT advocacy groups. And this debate over these positions within the Book of Discipline have been going on for decades now, with many within the denomination wanting the church to change with the times, so to speak. And every 4 years, when General Conference has rolled around, there's been big debates over proposed legislation aiming to do that. And the legislation has always failed up until this year, in part because you have a diverse coalition of American conservatives and representatives from abroad, especially Africa, who are overwhelmingly theologically conservative. And so, up until this year, that coalition has always been able to successfully defeat these types of proposed changes.
Yeah, well, one of the things, that I had mentioned at the top that, I think a lot of people are probably familiar with is the fact that churches have been leaving, right? So, I
Mhm.
mean, what has driven these changes? You mentioned, until now that coalition has been able to push it off. Would you say that the exodus of churches, people leaving, has made it easier now for the more progressive wing of the denomination to sort of take hold and take power?
I think that was definitely a big factor. I mean, what happened was, starting in 2019 up until last year, you had over 7,500 congregations disaffiliate or leave the United Methodist Church. And the vast majority of those were conservative in nature, theologically conservative, that is. And so when you have that, you did have a big drop in the number of potential conservative delegates from America's side who could have been a part of that coalition I mentioned and helped block these things. But you had other factors as well. Another possible factor in why this year you saw these various changes finally pass was regionalization. In addition to the changes to the Book of Discipline, delegates at this year's General Conference they passed an amendment to the UMC Constitution that would allow different regions of the global denomination to determine their own stance on LGBT issues. And right now, that proposal, while it was passed by General Conference, it still needs to get a two-thirds majority from the annual conferences, the regional bodies, before it can be ratified. But a lot of people expect it to get ratified. And so there is a sense that possibly what happened was that a lot of people within General Conference thought that, those who would normally oppose changing the rules thought that, in return for being guaranteed the ability to maintain rules in their own backyard, they'll just be okay with this new change. And then there was another alleged factor, which is that there have been reports that there were about between 70 and 90 delegates from Africa who were unable to make it to General Conference this year due to various reasons. And different people blame different sources, basically. But that you're talking about 70, 80, maybe as many as 90 people who would have opposed these things or likely would have opposed these changes who weren't there to vote against them, basically. So you just combine all these factors and you can see why the changes to the rules passed overwhelmingly this year.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be honest, if you have all these people leaving over the years, this didn't just all happen this year.
Mhm.
People must have seen the writing on the wall. These debates are not new. It's been increasing. And so people making those decisions, churches making those decisions to disaffiliate, it makes sense to me that they were probably seeing that writing on the wall and they knew that this was going to be coming. But that is really interesting hearing those different factors that came into play. One area that you mentioned, a couple of different policies, this drop on the ban on funding LGBTQ advocacy groups, and also the removal of the required punishment for pastors who would officiate gay weddings. Those are very, very specific policies that make it clear that up until now, the denomination has taken a very specific stance on these issues, particularly the required punishment for pastors who officiate gay weddings. Can you explain what will now happen in place of that previous ban that was there?
Well, basically, they just simply they removed it. With the funding one, it was going into General Conference. The Book of Discipline included a provision which required the UMC General Council on Finance and Administration to ensure that, quote, no board, agency, committee, commission, or council shall give United Methodist funds to any gay caucus or group, or otherwise use such funds to promote the acceptance of homosexuality. And the vote to remove that was 667 to 54. And what that vote came, though, is it came as part of a consent calendar, which means it was a few other pieces of legislation kind of all grouped together and voted for. And so there wasn't really much debate on it. But as part of that consent calendar, you did see the loosening of restrictions, punishments for clergy who perform gay weddings. Uh, there was another consent calendar issue that basically it reversed the a special session of General Conference, which was held in 2019. They passed something called the Traditional Plan, which enforced the rules that the UMC used to have on the books, and also had a mandatory punishment for clergy who officiated same-sex weddings. Because before then, it was the habit of some like positions, progressive bishops and others, to give very light sentences to very light punishments to pastors who officiated same-sex weddings in defiance of the rules. And so the traditional plan gave them, like, I think it was like a 1 year suspension for officiating one, and that got removed. And so you saw that that these were the kind of things they took them out kind of piece by piece, so to speak. Some things were removed with one consent calendar. Some things were removed by another consent calendar vote. And then you had finally the official incompatible with Christian teaching language removed from the Book of Discipline by in a vote on its own. So it was they kind of chipped away these things piece by piece throughout the General Conference.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to watch, and it's not shocking in light of where the culture is that you'd start to see some of these denominations sway in the same direction. Obviously, you mentioned some of the African delegates that presumably potentially couldn't get there, and how that might have swayed things. How did people react to these changes? Right, we've seen pictures on both sides showing different reactions. What have the emotional reactions been of the pro and the con side of this?
Well, some of them were pretty expected. I mean, obviously, conservatives denounced it. Liberals, self-identified moderates within the UMC celebrated it. There was one reaction that got a lot of attention, which was that there was a small group of African delegates who released a statement after the changes were made, denouncing the votes. To quote the delegates, "We do not believe we know better than Jesus. We do not believe we know better than God. We do not believe we know better than the Bible." And they went on to say that, quote, "We are devastated now to be part of a denomination that officially contradicts the Bible's teaching on marriage and sexual morality. We return to Africa with important decisions to make regarding the future," end quote. And they also denounced, the lack of the lack of the 70 to 90 delegates who weren't able to make it. Now, for their part, the UMC establishment has opposed this statement. Bishop Tracy S. Malone, who's the president of the UMC Council of Bishops, she responded to this delegate statement, arguing that it didn't actually represent the opinions of most Africans at General Conference. She referred to the UMC as, quote, a worldwide church that embraces, quote, our diversity and respect our cultural, contextual, and theological differences, end quote. There was a bishop, a Zimbabwean bishop, Ibn Nawatiwa of the African Central Conference. He actually he was on the records backing up Malone's conclusions, saying that yes, most of us African bishops, we agree, with what happened, that we support the regionalization proposal, which is the regionalization proposal is a big thing because under it, African conferences could see themselves returning to the traditional standards, because they would basically be allowed to determine their own standards in keeping with their region. And so there's a sense of this is kind of a compromise. And so in that respect, you do see there is basically a disconnect. You could argue that some would argue that the African delegates with their statement represent the real opinions of the African wing of the denomination, but then you have African bishops saying that no, actually we support regionalization. We're okay with them having their rules and we having our rules in keeping with our different cultural contexts.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you're kind of between a rock and a hard place if you're coming from their perspective, in that, if you have a traditional biblical perspective on these issues and you're coming into this and you want to stay part of the United Methodist Church, if you go regional, there are some who are going to say, yeah, that's the best thing we can do. We have freedom if we do that. But others might still say, and I'm sure you're hearing this, okay, great, we're regional, but we're part of a body that is now saying that they're okay with these things we believe are unbiblical, right? Whether our region says yes or no, we're still part of a body that has made a compromise that we don't agree with. So it's really interesting, though, to see that people would probably take different positions on that depending on how far they want to take that allegiance to the denomination, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. There is some question. I mean, there have been some people who've urged the African churches to really reassess their stance with the UMC, and have argued that this regionalization thing really was unfair to them, because basically it's saying that no, we're no longer going to let you have a big denomination-wide say on this. We're keeping you to your place, and we're keeping us to our place. And there is something that's unappealing about that setup, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all right. So obviously a lot of big changes on the sexuality front and how that impacts and interacts with different, policies within the United Methodist Church. Are there any other notable changes, since this is what has dominated so much of the coverage and headlines around this, that would be worth people understanding when it comes to what came out of the General Conference?
Well, the other big one really is regionalization. I know that it's oftentimes regionalization is used, that the sexual morality debate is used as a big case in point for the regionalization, but just in general, regionalization can apply to other things as well and other issues. So you could see other differences possibly emerge between how African United Methodism operates and how American United Methodism operates, and it could indeed spill into the issues apart from this one. So that's a big thing. All eyes are now on the annual conferences, which are the local regional bodies of the UMC, to see how if enough of them vote to approve the amendment to the UMC Constitution allowing for regionalization. There's definitely going to be some big future stories about how those regions are drawn up, and how big these new conferences are going to be, and what they're going to look like as well. So you could see a lot of that. That's a major restructuring of how the UMC operates if it does indeed get finalized.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many moving parts, and where the denomination goes from here, obviously, it's not as though, to me, it seems like these denominations are going to lose more people than they are going to gain. You're not going to see people flooding into these denominations for the stances they're taking, but you probably will see other churches, leave as time goes on. It will be interesting to track and see. Michael, appreciate you joining us today and breaking it all down.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. We'll see you then.